Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel after a hiatus while I was working on some other things, which I'm still working on, but I wanted to come back and start producing new content again for this channel during this Easter season, because from an Anglican perspective, there's a whole Easter season. Recently, on a skeptical channel, my friend Jonathan McLatchie was talking about gospel reliability. And he said that he doesn't advocate and doesn't use the passage-by-passage approach. And the passage-by-passage approach is an approach to a document where each separate passage, each separate saying or pericope or whatever, has to have some special mark of truth, some special reason, or to be duplicated in some other source that you consider to be independent, or else you don't accept it, you don't listen to it. And he takes instead a holistic approach to gospel reliability. Now, this got misrepresented and misunderstood as his saying, because he used the concept of a holistic approach, that a document has to be 100% reliable or 100% unreliable. I'm not going to restate all of the excellent things that Jonathan and Erik Manning said in response to this. I'm going to link to their response in the show notes. And they did a great job, explaining that this was not what they were saying. They were not presenting this dichotomy where, either you just accept everything in a document or you throw out everything in a document. Everything in it has to be treated as true or false. But also, they are thinking in terms of, and we are thinking in terms of, reliability of documents and authors. And in fact, it would be impossible for us to get along either in daily life or in historical research if you literally didn't even think about, document reliability, if everything was done on a passage-by-passage basis. I actually anticipated some kind of weird claim that historians don't think about document reliability, and put up a video addressing that and showing that that's actually false. Historians do think about document reliability. I put that up some time ago, and I will link to that in the show notes as well, and I linked to it last Sunday to just bring it up again because it's timely right now, since this misunderstanding of Jonathan came up. So I thought to myself, well, what can I contribute to this discussion that Erik and Jonathan haven't already covered? So part of it is content showing that scholars do think in terms of document reliability. That's not some kind of weird Christian-y thing. It's a necessity of historical inquiry. In fact, the passage-by-passage approach is kind of peculiar to historical Jesus studies, and it arose from the idea that these are unreliable sources, which was accepted by a lot of mainstream scholars. But then, in the interests of trying to get whatever historical information we could get, they said, well, let's try to develop some criteria of authenticity so that even if we treat these as unreliable sources, which most of us think they actually are, we could still sort of get some information out of them. So it's not that the criteria of authenticity and the passage-by-passage approach are somehow the normal historical approach to all documents, and then Christians are coming along and suggesting that we take them to be reliable holistically. Any historian who's doing a good job historically is going to be evaluating source reliability and thinking about whether a source is generally reliable, whether it's reliable about this type of thing but not that type of thing, and so forth. But the passage-by-passage approach was developed for use with unreliable documents so that maybe you could still get some historical information out of them. So that kind of historical perspective I think I can offer. And I may do another video where I add another instance that shows classicists thinking in terms of an author's reliability. But the other thing that I think I have to offer is a technical discussion. So the rest of this is going to be technical. I'm going to talk about probability theory and source reliability. This here is the odds form of Bayes' theorem. There is nothing Christian distinctively about the odds form of Bayes' theorem. It's just a theorem, okay? It's just a mathematical theorem. So we call this ratio here the ratio of the posteriors. This is the ratio of the probability of H. H is some proposition or other, given E. E is some evidence or other, over the probability of not H, given E. Okay, so E is our piece of evidence, whatever it might be. And what's the probability of H over the probability of not H after we've taken E into account? Well, that equals the ratio of the priors. So this is the probability of H and the probability of not H before we treat E as just given. Okay, so that's a ratio of the priors. And then this is the ratio I'm going to be concentrating on most of all. This is called the Bayes factor. It's the ratio of the likelihoods. How much would you expect E if H were true over how much would you expect E if H were false? All right. Now, I advocate that we measure source reliability, and a source might be a person, it might be a book, it might be an author, etc., that we measure source reliability by the magnitude of this Bayes factor. And this could be different for different subject matters. I'll get into that a little bit later. But in treating this as a measure of reliability, source reliability, I'm picking up on a suggestion made by a non-Christian scholar. Again, none of this has anything to do with being a Christian. This is just a topic in the probability literature. There's a lot of interest in how we measure reliability, witness reliability, and so forth. John Ehrman says that in order for a witness's testimony to contribute, it must meet what he calls a minimal reliability threshold. So the minimal reliability threshold would be that this Bayes factor is at least a little bit top-heavy. The minimum, at a minimum, it needs to be, in other words, greater than 1. That the probability of the testimony, where E is testimony, that H occurred, probability of that testimony, given that H really occurred, is at least a little bit higher than the probability of that testimony, given that H didn't occur. Okay? And this is something Tim and I used in our Blackwell article years ago. High reliability, then, would be measured by a very top-heavy Bayes factor. So if minimal reliability is just that it's, at least somewhat top-heavy, high reliability would be that it's very top-heavy. Okay, so that should be pretty interesting. Now, notice that in this equation, this odds form of Bayes' theorem, a very top-heavy Bayes factor can offset a very bottom-heavy ratio of the priors. So suppose something has a low prior probability, very low, then a high Bayes factor can more than offset that because they're multiplied by each other to give us our ratio of the posteriors, okay? And if you're interested, these have to sum to 1 and these have to sum to 1, but these don't have to sum to 1, and I'm not going to go into why right now. It's just it's the way it is. I can tell you the math if you're interested. Okay, so that's interesting because that means that a witness with a lot of credibility can offset and overturn the low prior probability of what he attests. Now, inductive evidence should inform our Bayes factor. When I talk about document reliability, I'm often just talking in terms of induction, because I think that's really easy to grasp. But ultimately, in terms of modeling, the idea is that with induction, we start to get a grip on this Bayes factor. And I think we do that by drawing certain conclusions, at least probabilistically, about the nature of the witness. So, for example, if I believe that a person has a strong moral opposition to deliberately lying, to telling things that are false, that's going to contribute to a top-heavy Bayes factor. Okay? The Bayes factor may be different, though, for different contexts and different topics. Let me give you a very simple example. Suppose that someone of my acquaintance has hearing loss, but has excellent vision. And I figured this out by an inductive track record. I've been watching him and seeing when he seems to be making mistakes and so forth. And eventually I figure out that he has hearing loss. But I also figure out that he can really, see things very clearly. Okay, so then if he tells me that he overheard some people talking and that this is what they said, that's going to have a weaker Bayes factor, especially if he could not see their lips, he couldn't engage in lip reading or anything like that. That's going to have a less top-heavy Bayes factor with regard to that subject matter, namely what he heard, than if he tells me what he saw. Okay, and I can even fine-tune it more by way of my inductive evidence about hearing loss generally, and maybe also what I've observed with him, that there are certain kinds of hearing loss, very common, that are affected by background noise. So I will have a weaker Bayes factor, a Bayes factor that's less top-heavy for something he says he overheard in a restaurant than for something he says he overheard in a quiet room at home where he's sitting around in this room and other people are talking to one another. You see how this works? Okay, so we try to use our knowledge to set a Bayes factor that is as relevant as possible to the testimony that we want to take into account. Okay, I might learn something else about his character. This would give rise to a further nuance and fine-tuning. Suppose I learned that he knows that he has hearing loss and that he tries to take that into account himself. So I sometimes hear him saying, I think they said that. As far as I could tell, they said that. He's like qualifying, okay? But if he says, they definitely said that, I heard it clearly. So then I take the details into account, and this relates to his character as well, right? That I've come to believe that he has a kind of character where he's trying to be careful. So that I think they said that would have a weaker Bayes factor than they definitely said that, because I know that he himself is correcting for his hearing loss. Okay, so that just gives you an example in a totally secular context. Details matter. If a person is speaking in a disconnected fashion, he's sort of babbling, and he's like, my mother is standing over there, and, you look over there and you don't see his mother, okay? This isn't just a matter of prior probability. Regardless of whether you have a very good grasp on the likelihood that his mother is standing over there, the fact that he's talking in this weird, maybe disconnected phrases, and then you put that together, part of the E then would be that you can't see what he says he sees, then you're going to have resources underneath the probability of E given not H. Probability of E given not H will not be very low because this is the kind of thing we would expect if a person is hallucinating. So even if this person was very trustworthy before, disconnected testimony that somebody else definitely doesn't see when the person should be able to see it, has a pretty decent probability given not H. When I was telling Tim about what I was going to talk about today, he said you should title it, It's the Denominator. So maybe I'll get that into the title. Similarly, if somebody has hearing loss and he's telling me about a conversation in a crowded room, then the probability of E given not H is somewhat higher, because he might tell me this even if this isn't really what people said, because I know that he has that hearing loss. And as you can see, the higher, all else being equal, the higher the denominator is, the less top-heavy the ratio is, right? That's kind of simple math thing. Okay, so notice that this is not naive. That if I evaluate someone and I say this person's testimony has a lot of cred with me, okay, going into this, I'm going to be very inclined to believe what this person says. Generally, he has a high reliability. I trust him. So his testimony to some H or other has a hefty, top-heavy Bayes factor. Does that automatically mean that you believe whatever he says? Now, this starts to get us into these accusations that we're just saying, is 100% reliable or 100% unreliable, and that's how historians should do it, and, basically we're idiots. No, because look at how the ratio of the posteriors is calculated. It includes the ratio of the priors. So just as a very top-heavy Bayes factor can offset a bottom-heavy prior ratio, maybe it won't. Maybe the prior ratio is so bottom-heavy that even a pretty top-heavy Bayes factor cannot overcome it. A case that I would consider to be marginal in this respect would be this example. So my husband Tim is someone whose testimony I generally trust a great deal to what he's heard and seen. I know that he has a very strong moral scruple against lying, so that feeds into that high reliability that I consider him to have. I also know that he almost never engages in heavy practical jokes. You might consider that to be temporary lying, and then later, reveals that that's just something that he doesn't do, and especially not to me. But suppose that he said to me, I saw an elephant walking down the street in front of our house. Okay, so I've got these considerations that give me a top-heavy Bayes factor, right? He says he saw it himself. He's not getting it from somebody else. It's in front of our house, so it's something he would have access to. It's not just some story he read on the internet or something. And I know that he has strong scruples against lying, and he tries to be careful, even about his own possibility of error. So this very heavy Bayes factor. But I also know that it's very unlikely, the prior is very low, that there really would be an elephant walking down the street in front of our house. So these are going to be going in opposite directions. And in opposite directions in a special way, because it's not just the particularity of H. Most particular things have, in one sense, a low prior, but it's specifically that it's an elephant walking in front of our house. That type of thing doesn't happen. I also don't see lions walking in front of our house. For that matter, I don't see horses walking in front of our house, though I wish I did. Okay, so you could think of the ratio of the priors and the ratio of the likelihoods as being in competition here. Which would outweigh which? Tim's testimony would certainly be some evidence that, improbable as it may seem, there was a elephant walking in front of our house. My probability would shift in that direction. So the ratio of the posteriors would be greater than the ratio of the priors, which means that his testimony would have an effect. But would it be greater? Would the probability of H given E, that posterior, be greater than 0.5? If we take that as like a cutoff, where I don't believe something unless at least it has a probability of greater than 0.5. Maybe not. Now, all of this would kind of be moot, because what I would immediately do is I would ask him for more information. I would question him. I'd go Google whether there was a circus in town, whether there was, I'd try to gather other information, right? But that's an illustration of how giving a source high credibility, treating a source holistically, does not automatically mean that you just believe whatever the source says. Though you're going to believe many things that the source says. And I'll get to that in a moment. Now, let's bring this a little bit more to the Gospels. The confirmations that I've argued we have for the Gospels are such that we conclude, I think justifiably, that the authors had a very strong objection to making things up and making them look like they happened when they didn't really happen. They were not in a genre such that they felt allowed to change facts. They were not in a genre like movies merely based on true events. They weren't in that kind of a genre. They're coming from sources close to the facts. Now, maybe the author himself, in the case of Luke and Mark, did not witness these facts, but he's getting them at very few removes from those who did. We conclude that the source that they were using, the human source or sources, actually knew Jesus. Maybe the author himself actually knew Jesus, knew his personality, his character, etc. Okay, you see where this is going. And that it's coming from that kind of a source of information. Okay, so if it's coming from that kind of a source of information, then that's going to give us, at least, prima facie, a top-heavy Bayes factor, right? Okay. Now, let's consider how this affects non-miraculous events. Let's go back to the just secular type of case. Not the Gospels, but just some other thing, some documents. Suppose you were reading a modern memoir that was of a contemporary person. Let's even say that this contemporary person isn't a controversial person where there's going to be a lot of bias, but it's just this contemporary person, and someone's saying, this is a memoir. So, think, for example, of Mike Rowe's memoir of his mother. His publisher wanted him to publish, that's ROWE, wanted him to publish something and thought it was going to be his own autobiography, and ended up being his mother's biography taken from her. Okay. And we're just talking in that memoir about something that they report that the person said. Okay? And we check out that memoir in various ways, and we find that it checks out again and again. So we start concluding that this is coming from somebody he's not massaging the facts. He's not changing facts. And he's her son, so he actually knows her. He's getting this from her, okay? And a saying, okay, we're not talking about Mike Rowe's mother claiming that she rode on a flying pterodactyl. We're talking about her saying that her father said such and such to her, or I seem to recall they had a weird cousin who lived with them for a while and what that was like. Okay, these are what we might call mundane events. If we conclude from other checking that this is a reliable memoir, then that is enough to overcome the mere low prior that results from these being specific events. I wouldn't have believed them before just because I hadn't heard about them, right? But that's easily overcome if we check it out and we decide that it's got this heavy Bayes factor, right? So for mundane events, at least, it's able to overcome the prior. So it doesn't require a separate confirmation, right? I don't say for every single passage in that memoir, well, probability V given H over probability V given not H is so weak that, maybe it's like only barely top heavy, if at all, just barely top heavy. So before the posterior is going to be higher than 0.5, I'm going to have to find that in some other document. If we're treating a memoir as reliable, then things don't have to all be duplicated like that. And it's a very bad principle of history to say that you have to find everything reported twice. Of course you don't have to find everything reported twice. You check out a source, and then if that source is credible, then if that source reports something, it's going to be enough. It's going to give you a high posterior ratio, because the ratio of the priors isn't particularly terribly horribly low, and the ratio of the likelihoods, the Bayes factor, is high. Okay? So think how this applies, for example, to Jesus' sayings. Okay? Again, the criteria of authenticity were developed because of the assumption that even when it came to non-miraculous events, the Gospels were not reliable, but how could we maybe get information from them? So then everybody loves multiple attestation, right? That if you think you've got independent accounts in two different Gospels of that Jesus said something, okay, maybe we'll accept that. Or the criteria of embarrassment or something. Now, those are nice things to have, okay, but it's not treating the source as a source in itself, okay, because it's meant to be applied to documents that are unreliable, sources that are unreliable. So what that means is, if somebody comes along and he says, it is impossible to know, this is something you find repeatedly in the writings of someone I talked about a lot, which is Dr. Michael Licona. He'll just be talking about a saying, like Jesus saying, everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. He did this on one of his videos back in 2020. So Jesus says to Pontius Pilate, everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And he said that it's impossible for historians to know if Jesus said that. So he's taking, and he had just acknowledged the only undesigned coincidence I've ever heard him say anything good about for the earlier part where Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. And it's literally right in the same dialogue with Pilate. But then he just moved on a couple of verses later to everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. It's impossible to know. So this is like the ultimate passage by passage approach. It's almost like a sentence by sentence approach. John, in that case, is not being treated as a source with value in and of himself. It's a historical source with a sufficiently top-heavy Bayes factor that even for mundane events, even for events that don't have some, problematic prior, even when we're not talking about, or when we're not talking about a miracle or something, that John can give us enough evidence that we would come to believe that the thing happened. All right, now, functionally, that's treating John as pretty unreliable. Okay, you can say, no, I am not undermining gospel reliability. But when every separate passage, you're feigning amnesia, as I sometimes say, of whatever other confirmations you've had, and then you're just saying it is impossible for historians to know, then that's not being treated as a source in itself. So it would be like if I had that memoir of some contemporary person and it told this story about the weird cousin that lived with them, and I'm like, well, I would need to talk to somebody else from that time period to see if I could confirm, or get something from somebody else to see if they would separately say, yes, that cousin lived with them. What am I doing at that point? I'm treating this Bayes factor as like really, really weak, okay? Whereas if I have a holistic view and I have confirmed this document over and over again, and I get a certain concept that it's coming from someone habitually truthful, close to the facts, who has information about this person, then it's a much stronger, much more top-heavy Bayes factor, and in that case, it can lead me to actually believe something when there is not an extremely low prior for it. So what this means is that treating a source as highly reliable is not just naively accepting whatever they say, but it's also not requiring them to be confirmed, sentence by sentence as you go through, or passage by passage as you go through. I hope this has been helpful to show how holistic approaches to reliability are not naive, but they nonetheless ascribe true, functional, helpful, high reliability to a given source if that source has checked out in other ways, and we thereby develop a certain view based on evidence of what that source was like in its relationship to truth. I hope this has been fun and helpful. I'm Lydia McGrew. Please come back next time.